There is a history in all men's and women's lives. History can be defined by our individual reaction or inaction to the events going on around us. Husband of nearly 50 years, father of 7, grandfather of 14, brigadier general in the U.S. Army, fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers, Lee Davis Thames is going to share with us his experience in the early 1960s to fight for voting rights in Mississippi and how we still have a long way to go. Please join me in welcoming Lee Davis Thames to the stage.
One hot August afternoon, I found myself seated by a pool of water, thinking of my grandmother. I'd heard all my life about how my grandmother had worked hard to get women the right to vote. Grandmother said that if you had the right to vote and voted, that was the strength of democracy. She also said that those who have been deprived of the right to vote will forever be at the mercy of those who control the system. That's another definition of voter suppression. And voter suppression was at the heart of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Let me show you what voter suppression looked like at that time and in my time. Segregated movie theaters. Swimming pools for the white, but not for the African Americans. Playgrounds for the white children, but not for the African American children. Even ice cream stands segregated, even though the ice cream came from the same container, having to ride in the back of the bus. Inadequate housing. Schools that were separate, but definitely not equal. And so it may not surprise you to learn that that hot August afternoon that I referred to found me with a few friends sitting by a reflection pool, participating in a rally that was called to end voter suppression that had existed in this country since the end of the Civil War. Now, you might ask yourself, what could one white Mississippian, what could be done by that person just out of the Army, home with a wife and a baby, trying to set up a law practice in a small Mississippi town? My grandmother had instilled in me that I had to find what had to be done. And that afternoon, Dr. King inspired me to do it. And so it was that when I returned home at the end of the March on Washington, I started, for the first time in my life, helping African Americans register to vote. Continued for a number of years. And some would say that I could have done more. Others would say I should have done more. And all I can say is that for the privilege, I lost valuable clients, I was boycotted, and my family got a lot of stress and strain for a short period of time. But I'm not special. And what I did is nothing compared to the heroics of the African American men and women who, knowing that they risked a job, they might be fired if they went out and tried to register to vote. And in some parts of the South, and a lot of Southerners don't like to admit this, but in some parts of the South, they ran the risk of being shot for trying to register to vote. The names of these people never appeared in the newspaper. They don't appear in the history books. They didn't even make Selma. But they are the foot soldiers of the civil rights movement, and without them, we could have accomplished nothing. There were, however, people, courageous people, who rose up and tried to do their best to help with the voting situation. It was dangerous work. Meetings had to be at night frequently and in secret. Meetings were in the African American churches, sometimes in barbershops after hours. Very few homes would run that risk. And there were other public buildings that we thought were safe. Didn't take long before those African American churches started being burned, however. And those other buildings that we thought were safe, some of them, including the building in my hometown, were bombed. 7 March, 1965, Selma, Alabama, Bloody Sunday. On that day, 600 courageous African Americans met at Brown Chapel with the intention of going across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Highway 80 to Montgomery to demonstrate against voter suppression. When they got to the crest of the Edmund Pettus Bridge that day, they looked down and they saw the sheriff's posse down there, and they saw the Alabama Highway Patrol waiting for them. They were shouted at, "Stop, go back." They marched quietly, didn't sound off, and again, they were told, "Go back." They kept marching. And at that moment, the sheriff's posse and the highway patrol attacked. Ten days later, Dr. King announced that there would be another try to march from Selma to Montgomery. It was to begin on the following Sunday, and it seemed like thousands of people came to Selma to participate. And on that Sunday, 4,000 people crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge en route to Montgomery. It was cold, at least for us thin-blooded Southerners, and it was windy. And by Wednesday, the rains came, and it was uncomfortable. But everybody continued to march to Montgomery. And you know what happened? On the day that the march ended in Montgomery, the skies cleared, and there were 25,000 marchers. The march from Selma to Montgomery ended triumphantly. But voter suppression in the South and the rest of the country continued. There were volunteers there in Montgomery who were to take marchers from Montgomery back to Selma. And one of those volunteers was a lovely lady named Viola Liuzzo, white lady, mother of 6, lived in Detroit, Michigan. She picked up a group in a car and drove back to Selma, dropped them off at Brown Chapel, and then started back on Highway 80, coming back to Montgomery to pick up another crowd. While she was on Highway 80, a car loaded with 4 Ku Klux Klansmen overtook the car, fired into that car, and she was murdered. Those 4 Klansmen were indicted for murder and were acquitted. A few months later, Jonathan Myrick Daniel, who was a white Episcopal seminarian, was murdered in Haneyville, Alabama, which is a small town between Selma and Montgomery. Murdered by a white man named Tom Coleman. Jonathan and 2 African-American teenagers and a Roman Catholic priest were working in that area, and they were arrested in Haneyville for voter registration issues. They were kept in jail for 6 days, and then they were suddenly let out, which was sort of happened a lot in those days. They walked down the streets of Haneyville, Alabama, to get a cold drink at Cash's store. And as they were coming to the store, and they got to the screen door at the country store, Jonathan Daniel opened the screen door and looked in, and he saw Tom Coleman standing in the middle of Cash's store with a shotgun at ready. Jonathan immediately threw himself in front of the 2 teenagers, and caught the full blast of that shotgun at close range and was killed instantly. Tom Coleman was also indicted and tried for murder. And an all-white, all-male Alabama jury found him not guilty. And you know why? The jury concluded that Tom Coleman had fired in self-defense. Much later, violence of a lesser scale impacted my family. We were at home in bed asleep one Saturday night. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from the local police. They told me they had a report that my house was on fire. We leaped out of bed, gathered the children, didn't smell any smoke, but we raced out the front door, and our house wasn't on fire. And the way we knew that was that my car sitting in the driveway in front of my house had just been firebombed, and flames were leaping up 3 stories in the air, which is what apparently caused the notice to the police. In 1960, there were several civil rights laws that were passed. But the people who were the heroes before that and during that, one of my favorites was an African-American farmer over in Alabama. He owned 100 acres of farmland, he and his wife. They raised 6 children, and he decided it was time for him to go register to vote. And so he did. He went down to the courthouse and presented himself, and they rejected him. And after they rejected him, he was asked, what about that? And he said, if what I have done with my life doesn't entitle me to vote, then Lord have mercy on America. Now, the Civil Rights Acts that were passed in the 60s did a good bit to help the civil rights movement generally, covering a lot of different areas of civil rights. But voter suppression continued. We learned from the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law that in the period from January 2011 until October of 2012, voter suppression legislation was introduced into the state legislatures of 41 of the 50 states in this union. And since that time, voter suppression legislation continues to be churned out by groups and submitted in legislatures across the country, even in those that have adopted some of the most terrible voter suppression laws that you can imagine. The techniques of voter suppression have changed, both as to target and as to technique. But even now, even today, those in control of the system still use voter suppression and try to suppress the votes of those with whom they disagree. The difference in targets in 21st century voter suppression are that no longer are they just African American. They are Hispanic, the elderly, the poor, and students, college students. The techniques are different, but they don't rely, of course, on the poll tax. They don't rely on the literacy tests that were so infamous. I went in to register to vote and at the appropriate age, and I was working hard trying to answer the question about the Constitution. And the clerk said, "What are you doing over there, boy?" I said, "I'm answering my question, this essay." He said, "Don't worry about it, boy. You're the right color. Come on over here." That was not the case with those with whom I worked, whose color was different than mine. But they don't use that, and they don't use intimidation. But the techniques being used today in legislatures throughout this country are much more subtle, much more sophisticated, and equally dangerous. One of them is limiting the type of acceptable voter ID card. Now, in one state of the union, if you have a certificate or if you are licensed to carry a concealed weapon, you can vote. Easy. But if you are a student in the college of that state, and if you have a voter ID card that was issued by, a student ID card that was issued by that state at the colleges and universities of that state, won't let you vote at all. Limiting access to voter ID cards. Another state, of course, like so many, have offices where you can go to pick up your voter ID card. In one particular state that I'm not going to identify, some of you would be embarrassed, those offices are open on the 5th Wednesday of every month. Other types of techniques are, let's go back, reducing early voting period. Now, you've read about that, and you know the impact on that. Discouraging voter registration drives. 2 states of the union have diabolical laws that are so stringent that even the League of Women Voters no longer will go into those states to conduct voter registration drives. And then one of the others is the tendency to, or the effort to move voting places away from access to public transportation. Having said all of this, and having sort of dealt with it for the last 50 plus years, I'm still optimistic. I believe in this country, and I believe that voter suppression will ultimately in this country come to an end. And I believe that in part because of an experience I had when I was working with the integration of the public schools in my hometown. We had eliminated the all-black schools and the all-white schools, and we assigned children to the school that was nearest where they lived, regardless of the color of their skin. And on the first day of school, the first day we tried integration, a white couple brought their little first grader to the assigned school, which was formerly an all-black school. And they were walking down the hall of that school, and the mama was holding his hand, and the daddy was holding his hand, and they were walking down, and the little boy was so excited about starting school. His older brothers knew it, and they could read and all, and he wanted to do that. And he looked at the walls and the posters on the walls of the hall, and he looked in the open doors into the classroom and saw what was going on. And then he stopped, and he turned and looked at his parents, and he said, "This school is not all black." When society catches up with that child, it will no longer tolerate voter suppression by those in control of the system. May take a while, but that's what's going to happen. And in the meantime, I want you all, as you think about this and leave here, to remember some words I've written down for fear I would, in my old age, forget them and not do them accurately. Words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has his foot on the tail of a mouse, and you say you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. As one who has spent over 50 years with people who have felt the weight of that elephant's foot on their back, I beg you to relook at voter suppression. Until it ends, the civil rights movement of the 1960s will continue. And you will be eyewitnesses to the same history that I have looked at for going on 79 years. Thank you.
There is a history in all of our lives, and I want to thank, and I hope you'll join me in thanking as they come up to the stage, Quentin, Ariel, Richard, Chaz, and Lee Davis for presenting their stories to us.